Hi everybody, and welcome to lecture number 1, a brief early history of second language acquisition. We know that second language learning has its roots in very ancient times, that from earliest civilization it became necessary for people to learn to communicate with those who spoke different languages. This was necessary for international trade. And we have a great deal of evidence, archaeological evidence, about how second language learning was accomplished, primarily through bilingual syllabaries. They were kind of the forerunners of bilingual dictionaries, but they were set up according to categories so that you would have words related to precious stones on one tablet with the target language and the speaker's native language right next to each other. And also grammars, and grammar is not just the rules for putting language together, but a grammar is a description of how a language works. And we have very ancient examples of both of those. One way of learning a language, and probably the oldest and most common way, was to actually live in a place where the target language was spoken. So a person would travel to a new country, would settle there, and would need to acquire a fair amount of language in order to survive. You had to be able to find food and purchase items and ask directions, and a lot of this was done with gestures and trial and error, but eventually people would be able to acquire at least enough of the target language to get around and eventually to work and make a living there or to set up trade. An alternative to that was to hire a tutor who spoke the target language. This became a very common thing to do with people who could afford it, people of means, the wealthy and members of nobility. They would hire a tutor to live with their child and speak only in the target language to their child. And this was a very ancient practice. We know that it was done in Roman times. We also know that it was done in the very modern world. It still probably is done in some places. But my mother-in-law, Aleha HaShalom, grew up in a very wealthy home in Germany. And from the time she was very small, she had a French governess who only spoke French to her. That actually turned out to be a real lifesaver for her when she was caught up in Vichy's France during the Holocaust and was able to communicate in perfect Parisian French, so much so that she was actually able to talk her way out of a camp because she spoke like a native French speaker. So this was something that was done in the 20th century for sure, and it possibly is still something that is done today. But much more common is the need for second language classes in schools. With the rise of a middle class and a merchant class, it became necessary to have a more educated population, and that generated schools. Schools became the way that education was taught to the masses. And instead of a tutor with 1 or 2 children, you had a teacher with a whole room full of students. That required a more systematic approach because you can't just focus on one person at a time. You have to be able to teach to a larger group. And the classical method, or the grammar translation method, we know was the oldest method used for teaching language classes in schools. It was used in the Greco-Roman world. And because of that, Jewish educators in Israel, in ancient Israel, the end of the biblical period, beginning of the rabbinic period, they adopted this method to teach different languages in their schools, and it is an approach that is used to this day in the most traditional Jewish educational settings. We fast forward a couple of millennia to now, to Rod Ellis. Rod Ellis is a New Zealand linguist. He teaches at the University of Auckland, and he is one of the best, easiest to understand reporters on second language acquisition research that I know of, which is why we're using his textbook. In the textbook that you have, which was published in 2015, Ellis detailed how second language acquisition was influenced greatly by theories of first language acquisition. This is true. But that's, I think, a secondary influence. I don't think that was the primary influence. I think that elsewhere he's written about the influence of applied linguistics, because second language acquisition really started off as an applied science. It was originally embedded in the pedagogy of the 1950s and 60s, and second language acquisition research grew out of the debates about which method was most effective. And this was then followed by attempts to generate correct theories about how language, in particular second language, is acquired. And it was at that point really that the influence of first language acquisition came into play. But I think the oldest roots really were in the applied nature of second language acquisition and teaching in particular. So we know that the original method, and one of the ones that was very much in use in the early 20th century, was the classical method, or the grammar translation method. And it had been developed to teach Latin and Greek, ancient languages, but it was really being used to teach modern languages as well. Grammar translation is very good for teaching students to read literature and to learn more about first language grammar. It treats language learning like any other cognitive activity, and the hallmark of it is that the rules of grammar are presented. The teacher presents them directly and then drills them using vocabulary. And the vocabulary is taught with translations, and it is learned by rote. That was one of the language methods under investigation. Is this the most effective way to do it? As you may remember from the methods course, if you've had it, the audiolingual method developed as a result of the World Wars, World War I and World War II, which led to a need for people in America especially to be trained to speak modern languages. We couldn't just send soldiers off to Europe without preparing them a bit for what they would encounter there. It also reflected disappointment with not learning to speak the second language. Grammar translation is not really effective for teaching spoken language. It's much better for literary language. And so the audiolingual method was developed to focus a lot on oral production. And it did this through oral drills of grammatical items, which are very similar to the drills that you found with grammar translation. But while those were written activities, the drills in the audiolingual method were all oral. And these centered on mimicry and memorization and pattern practice. The theoretical basis for the audiolingual method came from Fries, who was a linguist, a structural linguist, and Skinner, who is best known as the behavioral psychologist, America's behavioral psychologist. So audiolingualism is based on behaviorist learning theory, which, as we know, is all about stimulus response. You think about Pavlov and his dog. It's the belief that all learning is based on A stimulus being given, a response happening, and the response being rewarded. And repeating this pattern over and over and over and over again leads to habitual responses, so that when the stimulus is presented, the response is automatic. In language learning terms, the best example of this is what are known as prattle terms. Those are the terms for moms and dads. Mama, dada, mom, dad, mama, papa, and so on and so forth. And typically, when babies start making sounds, as they do, when they make a ma, 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 mom goes absolutely beside herself with joy, and the child immediately is rewarded for having produced that sound. And the same thing happens when they say da, 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 da. These are the earliest consonants and vowels that babies produce. So it is no surprise that in every language that I can think of, the prattle terms usually consists of m and n with an ah for mom, and d and p with an ah for fathers. No coincidence, and certainly this is an example of language following behaviorist patterns. However, it's the only example I can think of. So Skinner held that first language acquisition is based on habit formation, and that errors in the second language are due to interference from the first language. The first language interferes with the learner acquiring the proper habits. In order to combat this, a new science developed known as contrastive analysis. It was a way of comparing two languages to find the areas of difference and similarity. And the assumption was that if the languages were different, it would lead to interference, and therefore you had to really focus on those areas. But that things that were similar would be easy for the learner to acquire. What happened was that they couldn't correlate those two things. They couldn't correlate difficulty with difference, for example. And they also, in the process of contrastive analysis, found that languages have high degrees of similarity, especially in their deep structure, that there are limited ways that languages can operate differently, and that as a result, languages actually share more in common on a deep level than they share differences. On a surface level, they can be vastly different, but on the deep structural level, they're highly similar. The linguist associated with is Charles Carpenter Fries. He was an American linguist and language teacher. He believed that teaching and learning should follow scientific principles. And he was a structural linguist who really laid the groundwork for the audiolingual method from a theoretical point of view. The other person most associated with the development of the audiolingual method was Robert Lado, who was a very early proponent of contrastive analysis and contrastive linguistics. He actually set up the structures for how to compare two different languages. And he wrote, in the comparison between native and foreign language lies the key to ease or difficulty in foreign language learning. I don't necessarily agree with him on that. I do think that there are differences between native language and a second language, and it helps to be aware of them, but I don't think that the comparison provides the key to either the ease or the difficulty in language learning. All of this came to a head in 1959 when a young linguist at MIT by the name of Noam Chomsky wrote a review of Skinner's verbal behavior, and he attacked it at its foundational level, at its linguistic level, and his attack was so brilliant that it ushered in a whole wave of criticism of the behaviorist accounts of first language learning. Chomsky does not necessarily have the best reputation in the Jewish world. He has taken some stands regarding Israel that the Jewish community is not altogether happy with, but he grew up in a very committed Jewish home, and in fact is connected to Graz totally. His father was William Chomsky, and William and Elsie were both faculty members at Graz College. William was head of the Hebrew department here, who transformed it into a premier Hebrew department at the time. And Noam himself attended Graz, learned Hebrew at Graz. I believe he actually even taught at Graz. And he, in fact, wrote his master's thesis on aspects of Hebrew grammar based on what he had learned at Graz. He was a Hebraist at the time. And interestingly enough, he changed the pronunciation of his family name from Chomsky to Chomsky because when he entered public high school, they sat him in the middle of the room with the students whose names began with K, because they didn't recognize that his name actually began with C. So when he changed it to the English pronunciation, Chomsky, they moved him up toward the front of the class. It's kind of a wonderful anecdote that I heard from him directly in an interview he did with one of our students. Anyway, Chomsky theorized the presence of an innate capacity within the human mind that he called the universal grammar. The universal grammar consists of principles of how any language, any human language, might operate. And within the universal grammar, there was also an acquisition device, which was the innate ability to hear language and to start analyzing it and to learn it naturally, to acquire it naturally. So the universal grammar begins with language input. It is analyzed within the universal grammar that the learner kind of begins to experiment with producing trial utterances to see if they can communicate and get their message across to other parties. And it's that part of the mind that allows all of this to happen. And it allows any child, any small child, any baby, infant, to learn any human language. Hard on the heels of critiques of first language acquisition, those critiques quickly spread to second language acquisition and the audiolingual method. Because if first language acquisition was not habit formation, why would we think that that would be what is supposed to happen in second language acquisition? And if second language acquisition is similar to first language acquisition, does it follow the same natural route as first language acquisition? And at the same time, there were criticisms of the audiolingual method itself, because people could function beautifully in pattern practice but be unable to carry on a conversation in real circumstances. So that also factored into the attack on the audiolingual method. By the 1970s, these kinds of challenges were all over the place, and there were also challenges to the behaviorists' idea that second language errors were a result of interference from the first language. Two researchers in particular, Heidi Dulé and Marina Burt, studied child learners of Spanish, and they found that only 3% of the errors made by those children could actually be traced to first language interference. Now, studies involving adult learners have found more interference-based errors, and no one has really been able to replicate the findings that Dulé and Burt found, although in all of the child studies, all of the second language studies of children, there are fewer interference-based errors than there are for adults. And with adults, at the furthest extreme, it's still less than half of all errors that can be traced to first language interference. That said, an awful lot of second language errors are really similar to the kinds of errors that small children make when they're learning their first language. And I have to say this, first language errors are not really errors. They're not mistakes in that kind of way. They're learners' attempts at testing a hypothesis about how the language works. And parents tend to absolutely cherish the kinds of errors that their children make. I remember our great nephew, when he was first learning language, he said something was not a mistake, it was on purpose, which I thought was just charming. And it's something that we continue to say within the family, because it was just such a cute way of expressing a deliberate action when he didn't know the word for deliberate. So some errors in first language are developmental, and studies have shown that second language learners, that first language learners acquire their native language in highly similar ways. And the same is true for some aspects of second language learning. There does seem to be a natural course of development. We're going to learn about that in this class, but it's not exactly the same as the natural course of development for first language. By the 1970s, second language acquisition as a field was really coming into its own. There were lots of different research studies going on a whole lot of different aspects of language learning, and a number of really elegant theories were starting to be developed. One of these is the interlanguage theory. This was developed by Larry Selinker, and he based it in part on an article by Pitt Corder from 1967, an article called The Significance of Learners' Errors. Selinker took that and carried it a few steps further through the theory of interlanguage, which he published in 1972. Essentially, interlanguage is the systematic knowledge of the second language, which is independent of both the second language itself and the first language. In other words, it serves as kind of a bridge between what the learner knows about the first language and what the learner knows about the second language, and their efforts to figure out how the second language really works. The term can be used in a lot of different ways, but when it refers to a system that is observed at a single stage of development, it is referred to as an interlanguage. But by the same token, at every stage, the learner has to create a unique language system. It's unique to the learner and completely independent of others and of the two languages, the learner's native language and the second language, and that is known as the interlanguage continuum. Selinker basically said that interlanguage has three properties that characterize it. One is overgeneralization. This is the learner's attempt to take a pattern that they recognize from the second language and apply it in lots of new situations. Unfortunately, when they apply it in a new situation, it sometimes is not correct. My best example of this was when I was a student in Haifa, the University of Haifa. I had a friend in a beginning Hebrew class. His teacher asked, "Ech nosim liYerushalayim?" And my friend very proudly said, "Efshar linsua liYerushalayim ba'otobus o b'sherutim." So he took the plural suffix im and applied it to the word sherut, a shared cab, shared taxi, thinking that sherutim would mean more than one shared taxi, not realizing that sherutim has a very specific meaning, and he had therefore then said it was possible to travel by bus or by bathroom. Not exactly what he intended, but that's a really good example of overgeneralization. The second characteristic or property is known as transfer. This is a reinterpretation of what the behaviorists called interference. The behaviorists claimed that the first language will interfere with the second language. Salinger said, no, the first language provides information that may inform the second language, and it may inform it correctly or it may inform it incorrectly, but that's one of the strategies that's used. Transfer is how he referred to this, transferring of information from L1 patterns. So a prime example of this is the Hebrew use of yesh and ein. Yesh meaning there is, when it's put with a preposition or a pronominal phrase like li or lacha. Yesh li means I have. I can say yesh li kelev. Now, how do I say I don't have a cat? I have a dog, but I don't have a cat. Beginning Hebrew learners will often say lo yesh li chatul. Yesh li kelev velo yesh li chatul. Lo yesh being incorrect, but it is exactly how that pattern would work in first language, and so they transfer it to the second language instead of saying ein. And the third characteristic that he identified is fossilization. As language learners progress through their learning, they often hit plateaus. Pretty much everybody hits plateaus in learning. So they're moving along, going at a great pace, and suddenly they hit a plateau. And it may take some time before they're able to then move forward again. But fossilization is kind of a permanent plateau. This is what happens when the learner's language ceases to develop any further. That's a property of, or a characteristic of interlanguage. They're just, in many learners, there comes a moment where they can't go any further. So these are some of the theories that we'll be dealing with over the course of this course. And there's one other thing that we will be dealing with, and that is certain myths. There are myths about language learning, and there are myths about language. So in this course, we're primarily going to focus on myths about language learning, but I can't resist giving you a little information about one of the great language myths of all times. The first myth that I just really can't resist discussing is known as the Great Eskimo Vocabulary Hoax. This began with a gentleman named Franz Boas. Boas was a German-American who has become known as the father of American anthropology. He was particularly taken with the Inuit people, the Eskimos of northern Canada, and he documented their culture and their language. In fact, Boas was really clear that language was a very, very important aspect of culture, and he insisted that anyone studying the culture of a group of people needed to learn their native language in order to really understand them. He also went he countered the then widely held notion that primitive people have primitive languages, and that they're primitive because their language is primitive. He carefully documented Inuit language to prove that it's just as sophisticated as any language in Europe. And he insisted that his students do the same. One of his students was Margaret Mead, who famously wrote about Samoa. Another of his students was Edward Sapir. Sapir took Boas's ideas about language and the importance of language and carried it a step further. He held that language expresses perception, and that in order to understand perception, you have to understand someone's language. He wrote, "No two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached." So Boas, in his 1911 description of Inuit languages, claimed that there were 4 unrelated roots for snow, for different kinds of snow, that they had words from 4 unrelated roots. Benjamin Lee Whorf, who was a student of Sapir's, although an amateur language person, he was not a trained linguist. He actually worked for an insurance company, but he was totally captivated by language. So he studied with Sapir at Yale. Whorf embellished this and said that there were 7 words, 7 unrelated roots for snow in Inuit languages, and suggested that there might be more. Subsequently, people picked up on this and started embellishing it with claims that there were as many as 9, 48, 100, 200, even 400 different words for snow. But in reality, experts tell us that at the limit there are about a dozen. And English is not really very far behind in that count, because we have lots of different words for snow. Snow, sleet, powder. I grew up in the West. Powder was very big because it's so good for skiing. Corn snow, not so good for skiing. That's that crusty snow. Hail, blizzard, flurry, hardpack, slush, dusting, and so on and so forth. But Whorf really pushed this theory. He created a hypothesis that has come to be known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis of linguistic determinism. This is the idea that your language dictates your thinking, and that restricting language will restrict your thinking, or relativity, that you can't have thoughts outside of what you can express in language. This idea got picked up and carried like a football by George Orwell in his dystopian novel 1984, where the government is specifically controlling the thought processes of the citizens through the language known as Newspeak. And Newspeak is a language that shrinks every year, and it shrinks so that more control can be exerted on people's thought processes. So all of this is to say that there is no proof of either the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis of linguistic determinism or of linguistic relativity. There's absolutely no proof of it, even though we have spent 40 plus years researching it. So if you have heard that there are 100 different words for snow, that the Eskimos have all these words, forget about it. They have about as many words for snow as we have in English. So these are the kinds of things that we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. We'll be looking at the research, we'll be looking at the theories, and we will be looking at how all of this applies to teaching. One thing I will say is that I have learned from all of my teachers, "Miko melamdai hiskalti," as they say, and I do like to include a little bit of humor, even in such a serious subject. I do this because one of my fifth grade teachers taught us physical science, and he believed firmly, Mr. Turner, that if you laugh at something, you'll remember it. So he would always show us these films of like a baseball being thrown through a glass window and shattering in slow motion. And when we were done watching the film, he would then show it backwards to make us laugh. Because as he said, if you laugh at it, you'll remember it. So I hope that you can laugh and also remember. Thanks, and I'll see you next week.